And welcome back. Now, bail hearings for military veterans accused of holding 2 ministers and a deputy minister hostage will start today. The group was charged for allegedly holding members of the executive against their will at the St. George's Hotel in Centurion on Thursday last week. Now, the 2 ministers, namely the minister in the presidency, Mondli Gungubele, Defence Minister Thandi Modise and the Deputy Minister of Defence, Thabang Makwetla, had to be rescued by police after they were allegedly blocked from leaving a meeting that was arranged to listen to the military veterans' lingering concerns about their welfare. Now, South African National Defence Union's National Secretary, I Pikkie Greeff, joins us now virtually to discuss some of these developments. Pikkie, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, let's first start with the charges that have been brought against the military veterans. Very serious charges based on the country's Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorism and Related Act. But what is Sandu's view on what happened on Thursday?
Well, look, I think it's quite clear that there was a serious situation developing. And that's probably why the task force of the South African police services was sent in to rescue the situation. It's a very unfortunate situation, and it's a very unfortunate way in which these people apparently found it to express their views, opinions, or demands to the Minister of Defence or the ministers that were present there. There are some legal avenues which one can follow in pursuing one's benefits.
So let's look at where the consternation stems from. So the Military Veterans Act of 2011, among other matters, was aimed at recognizing the role that was played by the veterans in the country's liberation struggle, and also to take care of those that came from exile, by outlining, among other things, Pikkie, the benefits that would be available to veterans. Let's talk about that process and, as far as you know, how well that has been implemented.
Well, I think, firstly, let's just understand that the Military Benefits Act was not only designed for the former non-statutory forces who fought in the liberation struggle. It was designed for every person who served in the military in some kind of capacity. That is the definition that's contained in the Act. But yes, military or liberation struggle veterans were included in the Act, and that was the main purpose of accommodating those people in terms of the service that they had rendered. The benefits that are available are like housing, it includes medical, it also includes bursaries, study bursaries, and so on, and is subject to a person registering as a military veteran and then applying for the benefits, to which a means test is then applied. One must also understand that not all former liberation struggle veterans necessarily joined the Defence Force in 1994 upon integration. They chose to take so-called demobilization pension payouts or packages, and which made them ineligible for integration, but they would still qualify under the Military Benefits Act for those benefits that are available to all military veterans.
So, as you say, looking at all the armed forces pre-democracy and integrating all of them, but just in terms of the way things are right now, as they stand today, notwithstanding the fact that there have been obviously some discrepancies in terms of making sure that the processes are in place, and also that everyone who claims or alleges that they had fought in some way or another in the liberation struggle or in the South African Defence Force. Is everybody treated equally at this point, Pikkie? Everybody who has been recognized by the system, at least?
I don't think it's a question of people being unequally treated. I think it's a question of administrative backlog in some cases. When you start providing benefits such as housing, free housing to thousands of people, then obviously there's bound to be a backlog somewhere along the line. And that's just an example of one of the many benefits that's available and for which many hundreds of people are applying. So obviously there's going to be a waiting period for some individuals until the actual benefit materializes. And I think that's perhaps where some of the unhappiness does enter into the picture. As with any other cumbersome administrative process, there's always going to be the person who's the beneficiary, but who has to wait at the end of the line before the benefit comes his way. We've seen this with RDP housing, and there's many other examples of the same. I just think that having said that, one should also see the context within which these persons acted during the so-called hostage drama, and that is that they were making some quite extraordinary claims and demands that's not contained in current legislation. Such as a 4.2 million rand cash payout to each and every person who fought prior to 94 in the non-statutory forces. It's not clear what the rationale or the basis of that calculation or demand is. And, perhaps some rational talking and negotiations and lobbying in the correct places with the correct people would have yielded much more results. Because if you engage in these kinds of actions and try and be militant about it and even break the law, you're really damaging or potentially damaging the credibility of veterans who really do have real problems and want to address them in the correct way.
And that is a fair point. But conversely, it's been 27 years since the advent of democracy in this country. And, in terms of them having to wait all of this time and still not getting any finality to this matter, would you say that that is fair? Are there complaints in that regard? The fact that things are not moving along as swiftly as perhaps they should or could, are they, are those demands and those complaints legitimate, Pikkie?
Well, I think we should first establish, if we're referring to this group specifically, whether, they are in fact credible claims that they are military veterans. That's the first thing.
But even to that point, Pikkie, and let me interject there. At this point, should we even be talking about the legitimacy? This is 27 years on. Surely this process should have been completed and sewn up a long time ago. We shouldn't be talking about legitimacy in 2021.
No, surely, but then we should also recognize that the statute that manages or determines military benefits, veterans' benefits, only came into being, as you said, in 2011. And yes, it is 10 years down the line. And yes, probably the administration is too slow. And all I mean by saying establishing whether they are veterans or not is, did they in fact go through the legal process to register as veterans? And despite that, or notwithstanding that registration, are still awaiting the benefits that are available. That's the question one has to ask. And if the answer to that is yes, they're still waiting, then obviously they have reason to be aggrieved about it.
And just with regard to some of the complaints, you said some of them, for example, the demand of 4.2 million rand payout to each individual is not legitimate. But which of their concerns would you say are legitimate?
Well, look, the concerns about housing and medical care, those are the two that stand out. And these are already catered for in the military veterans statute. So, it might be a question that they've applied for them but not received it yet, in which case, obviously, they're going to be upset. Or it's quite simply they aren't aware that there is that avenue of redress and they chose some other way to try and obtain it. Any benefit, by the way, whether it's a 4.2 million rand payout or whatever the demand might be, is not something that in any event rests or vests within the authority of the Minister of Defence or the President of this Republic. It's something that has to go through Parliament and be legislated. So in that sense, one can understand if there is frustration with the politicians moving too slow. And I also said it on some other platforms that, or some other media outlets that, one seldom sees, or it seldom gets any prominence that there are any platforms where veterans are actively and on an ongoing basis consulted about existing benefits, the expansion of existing benefits, the enhancement of existing benefits. One doesn't really often hear about government or the state and veterans coming together in a formal setting and seriously discussing this with a view to amending legislation where needed or where thought needed. So I really do think that the platform for veterans has become somewhat watered down, and that is probably something that one would have to look at in future to have these people feel that they are in an inclusive environment and they are being listened to, and have rational talks between the parties.
Now, Pikkie, we've heard in the past that there were monies issued. Do we know how much and who exactly benefited from that and how?
I think it's important to understand that prior to 1994, when the agreement was made to integrate the SADF into the non-statutory forces and the TVVC countries' forces, there were certain individuals who were in the so-called self-defense units. Now, these individuals did not go into exile. They received no formal military training inside or outside of South Africa at the time. And, typically they would have been an 18-year-old, a 17-year-old who was armed and indeed engaging in warlike activities against the government of the day, under command of the non-statutory forces, for instance. Now, for some reason, the distinction was made at the time that if you did not receive military training and you were not, or formal military training, and it had not been completed, then you could either join or integrate into the SADF and complete your training or receive your training, in which case you'd receive all the SANDF benefits, pension benefits, housing, medical, and everything that's associated with a career in the SANDF. Or you could choose to demobilize, even if you had received formal training, for instance, in one of the exile camps in the rest of Africa. You could choose to what they call demobilize, and then there was a pension payout in that terms. The amounts, I'm not quite sure of. They were not very substantial, but, people in dire need of almost willing to accept anything that looks like a lot of money. Unfortunately, that's this kind of socioeconomic society that South Africa lives in. And it might also be that some of those people who chose to the demobilization as opposed to integration with all those associated benefits, that they are now the ones who realize that maybe they should not have chosen the demobilization option because now 25 years down the line, they basically left penniless. But I have to stress that they still do qualify under the Military Veterans Bill for benefits. The question is just how quickly do those benefits get to them? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the indications from government and information and communication from government to know how to apply for these benefits, how to access them?
And you see, Pikkie, and I think, part of the issue is what you have just explained, the fact that, some people chose to demobilize, but are there sufficient records? Do we have the records in place so that everybody knows who's who took what, who decided on what to do at that time in 1993? Because I think this is also part of the problem, as you say, because people could have decided to take a certain benefit at one point and now are crying foul at a later stage. But are those records there? Has there been sufficient record keeping to know who's who?
No, those records are certainly there. One has to understand the integration process at that stage was a massive exercise whereby the different non-statutory forces, as well as the TVVC forces and the SADF, but especially then the liberation forces, because of the fact that the circumstances led to it that They weren't necessarily had the administrative resources in place, like, for instance, a formal defence force would have with regards to personnel registers and so on. So there was a process of certification that was overseen by agreement between the political parties at the time by the British military task force. It was called BMAT, and under the supervision of that task force, the liberation movements had to certify personnel registers, verify identities, and that was put through to the task team. And well in excess of 28,000 liberation strugglers, veterans, were identified that way and positively identified. And it were then those people who were given those options of either demobilize or integrate into the SANDF. So yes, there are registers. Obviously, you are bound to find people who did not go through that registration process or who fell through the cracks in that registration process. And then it becomes very difficult, especially after such a long time, to basically, to put it bluntly, convince someone that you were, in fact, in a struggle in some township, but you were just never on a register or recognized as a liberation struggler at the time. That becomes a very, very difficult thing to prove. And of course, it also opens the system up to abuse. There might even be some false claims in that regard.
Well, Pikkie, we're going to leave it there for now. And of course, the bail application for those 53 members taking place today. But we'll certainly keep our eye on these developments. South African National Defence Union's National Secretary, Pikkie Greeff, talking to us about the stalemate between the state and struggle-era military veterans who say that the government has abandoned the promises that were made to them. We are now going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back with the news at 7.